Okay, and we're live. Um, okay, so I think we'll go ahead and get started, and then as more people join us, I will let them into the session. So welcome everyone. I'm Koki, and I'm with the Transformative Justice Collective. Thank you for joining us for the dialogue on understanding drug use, addiction, and policy in Singapore. I'm just going to be doing a little bit of housekeeping, and then I'll hand the time to Kirsten and our speakers for today, who will be going through the session for the next 1 hour or so before we open up to the Q&A. So do keep your videos and mics off for the duration of the sharing session. Throughout the session, you can ask questions as the speakers are speaking. You can type your questions in the chat window if you're on the Zoom call. And if you're watching on Facebook Live, then you can type your questions into the comments. You can also, of course, leave any comments or responses you have. And I will be collating the questions and sharing them with the speakers for the Q&A. So yeah, and so just a note to be respectful and inclusive in our language, and also just a content note that mentions of violence, specifically judicial caning, might come up in the conversation, as well as other potentially distressing narratives or accounts. So do be aware of that. Okay, so I'm gonna hand the time to Kirsten.
Okay, thanks, Cookie, and thanks to everyone for tuning in on a Sunday afternoon. So just before we begin, I'm just going to give a short introduction to the Transformative Justice Collective. We're a new collective founded on the principles of transformative justice and committed to seeking the reform of Singapore's criminal justice system. So among the issues that we started looking at was the death penalty, but then that also then led us to drug policy in Singapore, since a significant proportion of Singapore's penal population, as well as including the death row inmates, were convicted and sentenced for drug offenses. And generally, we all know that Singapore takes a very, very tough stance on drugs. And the government justifies this as being an effective deterrent and a key part of keeping Singapore safe. But when we were talking about it amongst ourselves, we realized that we also haven't really had wider conversations about drugs, drug use, addiction recovery, and Singapore's drug policy, and also that we, members of the public don't really have a lot of understanding of where we are in Singapore in terms of supporting people who are recovering from addiction and how our policies actually work and what some of the practices around the world are that we could learn from. And so that's why we wanted to have this dialogue today. And we were very fortunate today to kind of in commemoration of Human Rights Day, which was on Thursday, but we decided to move our event to the weekend. We were very fortunate to have 3 speakers with us today to share. So we'll have Ben first. So Ben describes himself as an average guy with a wife and a kid on the way, and he's experienced addiction and is on a journey of recovery. So he'll be sharing with us today based on his experiences at the Drug Rehabilitation Center, as well as with the National Addiction Management Service, or NAMS. And he believes that in Singapore, we need more holistic, therapeutic, and affordable care for people who suffer from addiction to drugs. Then we have Dr. Winslow. who was involved in the setting up and development of addiction services, both at the Institute of Mental Health and in the community more widely in Singapore. Dr. Winslow is recognized as an expert in addiction and impulse control disorders in the Asia Pacific region and is the founder and CEO of Promises Healthcare. Then we have Prof. Adeeba, who is the president of the International AIDS Society for the 2020 to 2022 term. And Prof. Adeeba has done extensive research on public health implications of drug policy and has been instrumental in facilitating the transition from compulsory detention towards voluntary community-based programs for drug users in Malaysia. So we hope to be able to learn a bit from what our neighbors are doing as well. And so, as Kokila has said, feel free to ask questions at any time. And we'll try to have as much time as possible for Q&A. But first, we'll just start off with Ben sharing his experience.
Okay, hello everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Ben here. Okay, so I'll make it short and sweet. Okay, so in 2010, I finished my NS and then I started, working. And my first job, when I got my first job, was in washing the buildings, the window. So from there, most of my colleagues used, and I hop on together with them. I tried using too, because I had to work very long hours. Daily, I used to work 14 to 15 hours daily. So everyone was using, and I tried it, and it gave me the energy and all. So I had to work long hours too, because I was the main caregiver of my mom. My mom was sick. She had kidney failure, and I had to pay for her dialysis and all. So my mom was a single mom. We live in a one-room rental house in Singapore. So I started using. Then after 4 years of using, from 2010 to 2014, I decided to stop, to quit drugs and focus on settling down with my then girlfriend. We wanted to get married, so I thought that I wanted to stop. So that's when the problems came, because when I knew drug was becoming a big problem in my life, I went to seek help. So when I went to seek help in Singapore, it was quite hard, because I couldn't go to hospitals or name the addiction center in the government hospital, because they would report me to CMB within 7 days. It's a protocol to report whoever comes to the hospital. They have to report it to the Central Narcotics Bureau within 7 days. So that deterred me from going there, because I was crime free. I didn't have any records. I pay all my traffic fine all on time. I'm a law-abiding citizen, but I was so scared to have a criminal record. I was so scared to get incarcerated. And then the alternative choice I had was to go to a clinic. I googled, then this clinic came out, and I went there. But at that time, I couldn't afford the rates. I went twice, and I decided not to go anymore, because it was quite expensive for me at that time. I really could. It was quite expensive. I couldn't afford it. So from then on, I carry on using without any help. And in 2018, I almost overdosed and went to hospital, because that's the only choice I had. And from the hospital, I was referred. The hospital called CMB. From there, I was incarcerated. In 2018, I got incarcerated for my first time DRC. And during DRC, I share a little bit about my DRC stay. DRC first timer. It's drug rehabilitation center, but it's run by the prison services. I was locked up in total prison settings. We slept on the floor. Food was served under the door. There were 8 persons in a cell, pack, and that wasn't. It was kind of a punishment. I felt we had 2 visits per month, and it was a tough time in my life, because of that punishment. And when I went up for program, first time first time minor offense drug consumption, I had to serve 6 months in prison and 6 months outside using the electronic tagging device lah. So during my 6 months, I relapsed because of the work that was given to me by prison. I had to work in as a rider, which my colleagues were all foreigners because locals didn't want to do it. So I had work stress. It was too much work. I was very tired. So I relapsed, and then when I relapsed, I informed my officer, my prison officer, that hey, I was honest, I relapsed, and what's next? He told me to report back to him because he wants to send me back again to prison, which I was very scared, and I ran away from the program. I took off my electronic device and I ran. And eventually 3 months later, seeing the prison service and CMB caught me, and I was put back in prison, and that's where I got my first time. I got caned 6 times. That was my punishment. I had to be caned for 6 times, which I felt that was one of the lowest points in my life because they caned me because I ran away from the program. So that happened, and now, so that was what happened in DRC. For me, my overall story. So I've cleared my sentence. I'm a free man now. I don't owe the government anything. I finished my urine test, and I'm in recovery now. So so those were the most of the problems that I felt. So when I went to the hospital in the government hospital, they referred me. So I had no other place to go, and overall, that is what I faced. And prison programs, and when I was in DRC, the culture, the people, most of my friends who went into first time DRC are now on their third time in DRC. So I feel the programs in prison don't work, which they keep implementing. It works, but it has improved a little bit. We have counseling sessions. We have counseling sessions. We have graduation, and that is the only thing I was happy. They only had we had classes daily, but I feel the counselors can do a better job because it's hard to, because a lot of people keep coming back to DRC. First timers, second timer, third timer, fourth timer. So I bet there's a problem with the system, which I really can't pinpoint. I'm not so sure what was the big problem, but people keep coming back for drug use. So prison program, okay. And yeah, one more thing is insurance. I had an insurance problem when insurance doesn't cover mental health so far in Singapore for my treatment and all. So this is another issue that I don't want to go to hospitals for help because insurance doesn't cover. My insurance company, they sent me a letter that they knew I was warded because it covers my MediShield. Then they said that, hey, for drug addiction and alcohol addiction, this insurance policy doesn't cover your ward stay. Okay, so on a positive note, I would like to say Singapore I feel that Singapore has at this moment, Singapore has a few places where we can seek help for people suffering from addiction. There are a few places where we can go, but still the places where you go, still they will have to report you to CMB. So you can get help, but the authorities will still know what you have done. So yeah, with that, thanks for letting me share.
Thanks, Ben. So did you want to talk a little bit about your other experiences outside of DRC? So like with the national, with NAMS, as well as your Narcotics Anonymous?
Okay, so for NAMS, NAMS is, I think Dr. Winslow is the one who made NAMS, the National Addiction Management Service in Singapore. It's at IMH. So it's a 2-week stay detox. It's a detox. If you relapse or what, that is where you can go for help. So they'll keep you in the wards for 2 weeks, and they have some programs, and they will prepare you. They will share info with you on where to go, where you can seek post detox help for your recovery, for counseling and all. So that is NEMS in Singapore. I went there once and didn't succeed. I still relapsed after my NEMS visit, but then they opened up a few more doors. Once I went to NEMS, I got to know that there are a few other places which I can go for my post detox. After detox, I can attend drop-in centers and everything.
Mm. And also, like, when you do programs like the NA meetings, what are some of the other experiences that you hear?
Oh, so from NA meetings, actually this group currently helps me a lot. I am truly grateful for this group, for this support group. One thing I learned from them since COVID, I attend international meetings around the world, and it's so beautiful to see people in other countries where they attend the Zoom meetings in recovery centers, in treatment centers as a group. Mothers with children, they got places to go for treatment, and so they I feel that wow, they are so lucky to have that type of treatment there. Whereas in Singapore, if you get caught, or there's no such thing as treatment centers and all.
Yeah. So just briefly, one question before we move on to Dr. Winslow. There's a question from the
Okay.
Facebook Live. Do you mind sharing how you think the counselors could have done a better job or been more helpful to you in DRC?
Okay, in DRC, because I felt it was very dry. They just followed the book and they tried to implement. Maybe they could have done. They taught us about the prefrontal cortex, where our brain thinks, how we got addicted, how the limbic system work. But once we finish the program in 3 months, and then we have to serve another 3 months. So within the 3 months before I come out, I don't get to practice it in real life. So most of the things I learned 3 months I forgot, and when I come out, there's no one to guide me to practice all the skills that I learned in real life.
Okay, well, thank you, Ben, for sharing. And I'm sure if anyone has other questions, you can just put it in the chat box on Facebook or here in Zoom, or later you can raise your hand to ask the question yourself. And so next, I think we can move on to Dr. Winslow.
Okay. Hi. I'm not too sure where to start or what to talk about, but I'll just tell you very quickly, perhaps my own addiction journey. I was quite fortunate because I was trained as a psychiatrist, and then I was sent for addiction training in Australia. And it was pretty much an eye-opener, because just to let you know that as what Ben had shared, it's a lot easier as a doctor or therapist treating somebody who's there voluntarily than somebody who is being forced into a system. And one of the big things that I noticed was that they had a lot of support services, and it was where you had to use your own, you had to make decisions where you wanted to get well. When I came back to Singapore, we ran into all kinds of exciting times. It took us quite a while to actually start addiction service, because we kept getting told that addictions in Singapore are treated by CNB in prisons. And I said, in which case, then why did you send me for training in substance abuse and addictions? So eventually we managed to get people who listened and said, okay, let's do an all addiction service. We started something called the Community Addiction Management Service, or CAMP, in 2001. And from there, it was really interesting journey, because the first thing we learned from scratch what it was that a lot of people needed in recovery. I used to sit down with my team for hours just trying to figure out how can we help people, because they're so used, and this is part of the Singapore setting, where we are so used to being told what to do that unfortunately a lot of people don't use their own brains to figure out, okay, this is what I need to have. And one of the big things we discovered very early on was that we could detox people in hospital, but when we send them out into the community, they suddenly do not have the ability to have services, or there's very few services which are available. And in 2004, I believe, me and a couple of my other colleagues in camp, or the community addiction service, started We Care Community Services. And we are very happy that it's still functioning, but that's another opportunity now where more people with addictions can actually get help in the community. I'm actually proud to say that it treats a lot of people in Geylang, and I think that it's a sign that things are slowly opening up, but it takes a long time. Give you an example. When we first started with addiction services, we found that we had to fight. We had to fight or actually send out people or emissaries to talk to directors of CNB or MHA to say, please let us have permission for NA groups to meet, or Narcotics Anonymous groups to meet in the community, so that they can actually share hope and recovery and what worked for them, and use the 12-step programs. And it wasn't that easy, because when you started, there was this mindset. The first thing that they said was, if there are 5 addicts meeting together, then it's an illegal assembly. And we had to work through a lot of those issues as well. In the end, I must say there were enlightened souls that said that, okay, it makes more sense that if more people get well, then we have less, we don't have to do such hard work searching for people or trying to catch them because they're using. And so that is part of the journey that I've had. I left for private practice in 2008, and it's also been a pretty interesting journey there, because in private practice, I realized that we have a lot more opportunity to treat people and help them. But because of the costs, as Ben mentioned, it seems to be those that are actually holding jobs, or in our Singapore setting is the expats, because expat insurance, or most of the expat insurance, they do not have this local Singapore insurance system which says that if you're seeking help for a mental health issue, you cannot be admitted. I just give you an example. Just 4 days ago, I tried to admit somebody for alcohol detox. This COVID period has been quite terrible for people with addictions. A lot of them, either they learn to get well, as Ben, go to international groups, start finding your recovery journey, or they tend to relapse a lot more. And so a lot more alcohol, because during COVID, um, there's delivery, and alcohol delivery is done free of, well, not freely, but uh, it makes a lot more people relapse into alcohol. Alcohol and is almost like a gateway. When you're using alcohol, it's a lot easier to move into use of meth or other substances. Um, Kristen, I've got a whole set of slides. I'm not too sure whether to share all of them, but what I can do is I can just run through them very quickly, and so it gives an overview of how a medical person maybe looks at addiction.
Yes, sure. Yeah.
Okay, let
You
me.
can highlight the ones that you think are most important.
Okay, thank you. Hmm. It seems to have disappeared. Give me a sec. Ah, ah. Can you see this now?
Not at the moment.
You can't?
No.
Oh, no. This is what happens when we are old, and let me escape and come out of this. Shaman, stop talking first, please. I can't concentrate either. Just give me a second. Let me try and find this. When I click save, share screen. Got it.
There we go. Yeah.
There we go. Let me just go to the beginning. I'm very fortunate that I've got a team now doing addictions, and we are starting up a whole addiction service. And the addiction service people actually help me share. Can you see it now, Kristen?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so this is my quick take on substance addiction in Singapore. Here's a very quick overview. Please don't be overwhelmed, because I think that they thought I was talking to a professional audience here. But I'd like to share with you American Society Addiction Medicine, that addictions are primary chronic diseases of brain reward, motivation, memory, and circuitry. And dysfunction leads to the characteristic biological, psychological, social, and spiritual manifestations. Reflected is in an individual pathologically pursuing the reward or relief by substance use and other behaviors. And I think in the American Society, ASAM, American Society of Addiction Medicine, they don't only cover drug addiction, but they cover the behavioral or substance addictions as well. This is the more recent one that was just last year. It's a treatable chronic medical disease involving multiple interactions among brain circuits, genetics, the environment, and an individual's life experiences. These are the types I think we all know. In Singapore, the predominant one 10 years ago even used to be opioids or opiates, and currently it is the stimulants or meth or the novel substances. Here's the pathways that go to addictions. Very often, the impact of addictions, there's experimental use. Most people start because of peers or colleagues telling them, hey, why don't you just try this? Like Ben said, when he was working, the group of people who work really long hours, and I've heard this many times among meth users, I needed to stay awake and do 2 or 3 jobs. The second is the compulsive use, where the use of addiction turns negative. Your social circles have less and less people who are non-users, and there is considerable impact on the family, on health, on work, on finances, and it's really a tough climb to come back. And then, of course, there's the dysfunctional use where you have grave problems in all aspects. I've had people who I see now, and I remember seeing a heroin addict, and he said, "How you've been clean now for 3 months? Wouldn't it be time that we help you to go find a job through WeCare or one of the other agencies, Sana?" And he said, "I'm really sorry, doc. I'm now 40. I started drug use when I was 16 or 17. I've never really worked or any proper job other than part-time jobs or gigs. I don't know how to apply for a job even." And so this is one of the problems, many things that need to be done. The social circle only comprises mainly users, family life falls apart. What is that? Apologies, let me get rid of this. I apologize. Am I still presenting?
Yes.
This is why I tried to switch off everything before, but unfortunately looks like there's a background WhatsApp. Okay, here are the risk factors I thought we'll just talk about very briefly. There's genetics, that we know that people with experienced addictions are more likely, family members like parents or uncles, aunties, more likely to develop addictions themselves. There's gender. With the substance addictions, it's primarily male. There are a couple of addictions which is primarily female, and usually the sleeping pills and to a certain extent the social media. The adverse childhood experiences, this is important because we just did a study in Singapore and we actually showed or correlated it very much to alcohol. Uh, we did not look at the studies how adverse childhood and adverse childhood, they talk not only on trauma or abuse or sexual or physical abuse, but also on neglect or where the parents don't actually pay attention or spend time with their kids. Then of course, certain personality characteristics, being a workaholic or competitive and other stuff like that. I'm just showing you briefly the stats for Singapore. Total and new drug users 2018 and 2019. And what we see is that it is slowly going up in terms of both new users as well as the repeat users. Overall, though, this is hugely better than the 1990s when we were seeing per year 10 to 15,000 people. Here's the substance abuse by type. And as we said before, heroin used to be number one, but heroin has since changed and now it is the methamphetamine or substances. And if you look at the third column, novel psychoactive substances, NPS, those have gone up tremendously. This I don't think I'm going to go into because just basically all you need to know is that addictions are complex and their brain circuits, your reward center. We, as doctors, we talk about the hijacked brain. Now, nobody starts using cannabis or drugs or anything saying that my aim is to become an addict. But when they start, after a while, they find that it serves a purpose. And then they use more and more to the extent that they find it very difficult to let go of it. And that becomes a hijacked brain. So this is the neurotransmitter involved in all drug addictions is dopamine. It gives you feelings of pleasure, increases your emotional well-being, stimulates an increase in transmission. And of course, it reinforces then your drug-seeking behavior with a positive loop. Okay. I thought I'll just mention very briefly that these are some of the studies that have been done. And it tells you that once drug addiction gets fully established, it really becomes pretty difficult. You have to have interventions or things that can be done to break the cycle. And this is where I think that Singapore has got the ability to be one of the world leaders because they have the ability to break the cycle, but uh, maybe we should do it in ways that would really help people. This shows that if you put a pipette into the brain of a rat and you allow them to press a lever that shows every time they press the lever, they will be able to get a hit of whatever drug it is, heroin or whatever. They tend to press the lever so much that they eventually die because they don't eat and they don't do other things. They're just seeking after the drug hit. Okay. Um, these are just genetics to show you that there's backgrounds. More often than not, it is males, and this is an alcohol study. It just basically shows that if you take children from biological alcohol parents, and they are brought up by non-alcoholics, they still have a 4 times higher chance of developing alcoholism. It just shows that there is a genetic component to most forms of addiction. Okay. Dislocation theory, I was told to just mention it in passing. So here it is. This is what it looks like online. Um, it shows that where we have at the top, a modern, globalized, and fragmented society, people find that life is no longer quite the same. They no longer have the community, the ability to have their needs met with groups of people. And then they move on to there's what they call a mass dislocation of individuals. Seen in my practice currently, there's so many people coming to seek help that come and say that we want to have help with adulting. I scratched my head for a while asking what is adulting, but apparently it is the skills to be an adult, to make good decisions, to learn how to deal with life. And this is where we had a flood of addictions. And while Singapore and most countries concentrate on the substance addictions, we need to know that people can be compulsive about a lot of things. If you ask me, when I was in government service or public service, the number one addiction was alcohol, number two was drugs, number three was gambling. Um, in private practice, the number one is alcohol, number two is sex, sexual compulsivities. And it trust me that behavior addictions can also break up families and destroy lives just as well as the actual drug addictions. And then on the side there, you see the consequences: family breakup, exploitation, theft, bankruptcy, suicide, and all the rest. Okay, I'm not going to go into all these things because uh, too much information, TMI. So here is Rat Park, and I remember first reading about it in studies from Canada, where they remember I told you about the rat where you put him there and he will keep pressing the lever so that as long as gets a hit of heroin, he is very happy. Well, that happens on the left. You see there, the caged rats will self-inject any psychoactive drug or powerful psychoactive drug like heroin or methamphetamine. But if you take the rats and put them into a more open society or where they had better housing, they had chance to live together, to meet with their other rats and do other things, they preferred water, a sense of community, rather than going and pressing the lever for drugs or drug pellets. Okay. So the power of drugs lies in the ability to transport us generally away from the loneliness and isolation brought about by the social and economic forces that are available. And that's what drug park, and you can look this up online when you type in drug park, what it is. Models of addiction, I thought basically I'll just tell you very quickly because this is one of the difficulties I had. A lot of people, especially because we have been fed in Asian society that drugs are bad and therefore people who take drugs are bad, and they consider themselves weak people or morally weak or there's something wrong with them. Uh, but the society pressures are also that these people need to have this bad behavior punished out of them. And so we do, more often than not, the treatment then in a moral war on drugs kind of environment would be caning, jail time, or institutionalization to try and deter uh, a person with an addiction from using. Um, I think this is important also because when we talk about moral model, there are many ways in which people practice this war on drugs. I'll give you an example. In Hong Kong, Hong Kong and Singapore share a lot of the same language. Hong Kong's Narcotics Bureau and Central Narcotics Bureau in Singapore share almost the same language when they talk about drug addiction. However, in practice, they mean different things. For example, Singapore says zero tolerance on drugs, which means that if you are caught or if you are using, there's no substitution and no other forms of drug use that is allowed. That's one. The second is in Hong Kong, they have actually about 10,000 people taking methadone programs, and they have got a whole team of social workers and doctors who are just involved in that. But they still consider it zero tolerance on drugs, zero tolerance on illicit drugs. But if you want to come out of your drug use, we will provide you with the tools to do this. I believe later on you can ask Prof. Adeeba as well. Malaysia has also moved down this route to being providing more and more help to people to come out of their drug use. Okay. This I thought we might as well just take a quick look at the recidivism rate. So how many times do repeat offenders come up? And apparently 58% of the total number of drug abusers is made up of repeat offenders. With regards to drug of choice in Singapore, methamphetamine has taken the lead, which is actually difficult because treatment availability for methamphetamine addiction is less well refined right now, and they're still trying to find the medications and drugs that can help compared to opiates. Okay, I'm not going to go and talk very much more about other things, but I just like to tell you about this I saw this about 20 years ago when I was doing research into the various systems of treatment that are available. And we got to find that in Texas and California, who I think originally our Misuse of Drugs Act was modeled after the three strikes law, where that they originally had, where the first time, second time, you're only given DRC. And I think that's great because people with just DRC actually don't have a record and they can actually get jobs in government service, public service, and everywhere else. But the third time you were caught, they would throw away the key and do all kinds of punishments to you. And one thing, it didn't work originally. And so this is what happened, that we found it more and more difficult. And the countries like California and Oregon, all the West Coast ones, they discovered that they had to actually manage it by allowing people to be put into into a system of managed care where they give them a choice. A drug court judge can actually say that I can put you into treatment where you will have urine testing once a week. You will have to see a counselor. You have to attend 12-step group meetings. And because of your relationship problems, you have to do marital therapy. At the end of 6 months, every 6 months, you will come back to see whether you're functioning well or not. If you are, we will allow you to do this. And after a certain number of period of time, if you've successfully stayed off your drugs, we will consider this wiped out. However, if you go back and decide that you prefer to take drugs than to get well, then the choices that kick in would be that you would have to pay your penalty. This contingency management was important to me because I still use it. And what it does is that if you have, for example, tell people go for group meetings, Ben will be able to tell you that initially there's a lot of skepticism and people don't understand, why do I need to go for a group meeting? But after they start going, they discover, hey, I can really get well. And what happens is that if you give them rewards or tokens, people fight for the tokens. So they keep going and trying to stay well by collecting tokens to, for example, every time you get a clean urine, you get a token. Every time you attend a group meeting, you get a token, and such like things. 1 second. Okay, and so I'm not going to go into the rest of the stuff, but these are just the treatment options that you have seen. You can stay in NAMS, you can do a medical detox, you can do 24-hour medical, sociological support, and outpatient services. Here are some of the things that are available now. And I must say that Singapore has improved a lot. Shout out to the fact that this year, things have started to change. Before that, we had this three strikes law. Now they are allowing people, even the third time, fourth time, who are coming back for their drug addiction, to go into DRC rather than actually be incarcerated for really long periods of time. Unfortunately, some of the aspects of the drug law are still there. And negative behavioral conditioning like caning and all that is still there, which it's still questionable whether that works or not. Okay. And these are some of the challenges. One of the things always brought up is that do we have the ability to treat people if they actually want to get treatment instead of incarceration? And so I think now I always bring this up that Singapore has the ability, because we are a slightly richer country, we have developed our manpower to the extent that if we wanted to, there's a lot more trained manpower available. This year, in the beginning of the year, we have had opening of Selarang DRC. We have for young adults CRC, which is Community Rehabilitation Center, which gives you treatment for a period of time and then follow up in the community. So they're trying a lot of new programs, but we still lack public health education to understand why people go into addictions. We know a lot of people with drug addiction convert over to legal drug addictions. So there's use of codeine, tramadol, pethidine, and other injectables. Then one of the things that we always say is that we should also consider the implementation of limited period substitution therapies. If it helps a person to get back their life, get back stability, because they really cannot, as this we're talking about chronic users who are actually addicted for 10, 20, 30 years to a particular drug like opiates, we should consider harm minimization issues or therapies. And then of course we need special research and to reduce the social stigma. I I got into a lot of trouble off and on because they say that Dr. Winslow actually likes addicts. Um, I think that as a doctor, you should like the people that you're treating. And part of it is because, wow, people with addictions, when they have made good or when they actually are able to turn their lives around and explore their own lives, um, actually are really honest, open, and contributing members of our society, which we should actually help. Okay, I think that's it. I'm going to stop there. Sorry for taking too much time, Kristen.
No, that's all right. So I think there was a question in the
Sure.
chat which I think kind of segues between both you and Prof. Adeeba. So like the whole positioning of addiction as a disease, as well as positioning people who use drugs as criminals, and having to go about it from this framing. How does that affect? So I suppose the question for you would be, how does that affect treatment? And then for Prof. Adeeba, it would be, how does that affect discussions about policy?
Uh, Go back into history about how this happened. I think in the 1970s, when they were trying to find a solution, Singapore actually did look at a public health model for addictions. But then it was they did not have the skills needed to treat addicts, and so they allowed doctors to prescribe methadone and other stuff at SGH, and things went out of control very rapidly. And I think our founding Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew quickly looked at the situation and said, "This is ridiculous. This is not a public health issue. This is a public order issue." And so we've been stuck in that model for a long time, that this is a public order issue. We want to, we are not interested in individuals in society as much as we're interested in the whole of society having uh, the ability to live happy, safe lives. Um, I find that it's a false dichotomy because we can actually have both. We can actually be the best in providing really good world-class evidence-based treatment modalities and fund it. And we should be still cheaper than incarcerating people long term. And that's what I hope, that with time we will be able to have a Singapore model which is uh, both humane and provides help for people in need.
Thank you. So Prof. Adeeba, So the same question, how does this framing as addiction as a disease or as a crime, and framing people who use drugs as criminals affect, discussions of policy and advocacy?
Sure. Thank you very much, Kristen, for inviting me to this dialogue this afternoon. Perhaps before I specifically answer your question, I'd like to go back to Ben's sharing, actually, and I think it provides an excellent frame for today's discussion, and kind of really highlights why criminalization of drug use just simply doesn't work, and how complex the whole issue of addiction is, which Dr. Winslow has very nicely outlined from a scientific viewpoint. It's a whole connection of genetics, of childhood experience, of peer pressure, and Ben alluded to some of this. Him dabbling with drug use started with having to work a very stressful job with long hours, physically demanding. And when we hear this with many other occupational groups, in Malaysia, we did a study of fishermen in Malaysia. It's the same thing, particularly those who are going out into particularly deep sea fishermen, who are more at risk of drug use, long distance bus drivers, long distance truck drivers, and it's the risk for drug use is sort of high stressful employment. And then Ben also alluded to the peer pressure that he was under through this job that he was doing that eventually got him addicted to drugs. So I think in directly answering your question on whether we should see it as a disease or as a criminal issue, it becomes a criminal issue when the person who uses drugs commits crime. Too often it's to sustain their drug use, or because they have been through this vicious cycle of going in and out of prison, stigmatized, and are no longer able to work. Then, I'm not kind of making excuses for them, but this is the reality that, we put them in that situation, we, meaning the society, puts them into that situation of this vicious cycle of addiction, drug use, going into prison, relapse, because there's, the prisons have been shown to not offer effective rehabilitation, come out, stigmatized, no jobs, steal to eat, families discarded them, and once again arrested for a minor crime, and back they go again into prison. So this whole cycle just simply doesn't make sense if you go back to the root cause of why adolescents experiment with drugs, and because of the addictive nature of some of these drugs, just then simply get hooked to it, and then find themselves in this vicious cycle that then, from not really creating a crime in the sense that, they're using drugs to harm, that's causing harm to themselves as individuals, but in the beginning probably it's not causing harm to anyone else, so shouldn't really be punished for that, right? Really, prison is for people who are creating harm to the rest of society. But, so in a way, our treatment for addiction is creating that problem, and later on the harms to society. So it's a complex issue made worse by this treatment that we feel or think is the answer to drug use and addiction. Now, the second thing that Ben described was the number of times he relapsed, and fortunately he actually came out of the overdose. And we know that the highest risk for relapse is at the time when someone leaves prison, because they're somewhat clean in prison, and then they go out and again, that stressful situation of going out and reintegrating into society puts them at risk of relapse. And multiple studies from around the world have shown that the highest risk of relapse in the first week or two of being released from prison. And then again, like what I described, then the whole vicious cycle starts again. Because the other thing about putting people in prison is you are, kind of putting them with like-minded people, those, who may have entered prison for, at least in Malaysia, for ganja or cannabis, may end up being experts in heroin and amphetamine and what have you, because you're in that environment of people who use drugs, anything from cannabis all the way to the more hard drugs, and also with, you may have gone in as a user, you come out learning how to become a trafficker. So, we are making things worse, in other words, by putting them in prison. And does it work? Well, we did a study 3-4 years ago now, when we had the opportunity to compare compulsory detention centers like what you have in Malaysia. They're called Pusat Serenity. So people who use drugs who were in these compulsory detention centers versus those who were receiving community-based methadone treatment. And it was no surprise really that after a year that those who were in the compulsory detention center, 50% would relapse upon leaving the compulsory detention center within 30 days. It's not to say that the methadone program you didn't have relapse, but the majority, if they were to relapse, would relapse at 1 year. And the proportion of people who relapse was much, much smaller in those who were on methadone compared to those who went to compulsory detention centers. And as I said, there are many studies to show the ineffectiveness of prisons as a rehabilitation center or institution for drug addiction. The other thing that I am very concerned about in terms of incarceration is with the changing in drug trend. Dr. Winslow is much more of an addiction specialist than I am. I am peripherally involved in it, but I don't, not like Dr. Winslow. I'm more of an HIV infectious disease physician. But what we know is the changing in drug trend, which is all around the region. There's much more use of amphetamine type substances and those drugs, which unfortunately to date there's no good substitute like there is for heroin addiction, where you have methadone, you have buprenorphine, you have those are two main treatment. But with ATS type or ATS group of drugs, we're still looking for that magic pill to treat. And the other thing is, in terms of the complications of addiction with ATS, is also different from heroin, opioid addictions, and where the damage and the to the brain, causes things like psychoses and real behavioral changes that, if not picked up early, and you're putting these people in prison where there are prison officers who are absolutely not trained to detect this, what may in the early stages be subtle changes that can just lead to worsening, whereas they should really be channeled into care. And although I said that there's no magic pill for ATS, well, at least the Dr. Winslows of the world can provide things like contingency management and motivational interviewing. And then there are interventions, particularly in the early stages, right, Dr. Winslow, that would help. So you are taking them away from potential help and good treatment and putting them into a situation where they are with people who have no idea how to manage these problems. So that is the other danger of criminalizing drug use. And I think it's going to be worse with the people who are using ATS compared to people who were or are using opioids or cannabis or what have you, because the changes to the brain are different for different drugs, and for ATS it can be quite severe. Feel free to jump in, Winslow, if you want to clarify this further. And finally, I think any webinars in 2020 cannot finish without some comment on COVID-19. And in Malaysia, 60% of people who use drugs, 60% of prisoners, and that's about 70,000, depending on, the census for the week. Let's say it's 70,000 prisoners in Malaysian prisons right now. 60% are in there for drug use. The majority are in there for minor and personal drug use. We are over capacity. The capacity for the Malaysian prison system is about 45,000. So if we have 70,000, we're about 25,000 over capacity. It is no surprise that we are now having outbreaks in many, many prisons in Malaysia. And so, unfortunately, it has taken COVID-19. Before this, we were also having problems with tuberculosis, which is transmitted in exactly the same way as COVID-19. So we were predicting this, unfortunately, as we saw what was happening around the world. It's no surprise. The prisons are overcrowded. It's poorly ventilated. The hygiene of the prisons less than ideal. Ben described what it was like in Singapore. I don't know whether the Singapore prisons better or worse than Malaysian prisons, but I can tell you that I've been to some prisons and they're not pretty, except for the one in Vienna. And so, yeah, so, forget social distancing, forget wearing masks. I mean, you're in there with these poorly ventilated cells. I must confess, I'm an infectious disease physician, and I know mask wearing is probably the #1 thing. But even I, feel that from time to time you just want to take this mask off. And when you're in a poorly ventilated cell like the prison, I can bet you that they're not going to keep their masks on 24 hours a day. On top of that, it's people are squeezing against each other. So it is no surprise that we are having COVID-19 outbreaks in our prisons. And there is a group of concerned medical practitioners, lawyers, civil society now that's really advocating with the government to really urgently do something. The Ministry of Home Affairs and the Malaysian Prisons Department, to their credit, are trying their best to segregate, those who are infected or potentially infected, have a system in place to screen, etc., etc. But it's an uphill battle, because if you keep putting people into prison, you're going to swell the numbers again, right? So we're advocating for things like early release appropriately, and also to look for alternative sentences and not, incarcerate anything and everything. So we're having discussions with the highest level of government to see if they can do this. And as I said, it's unfortunate that it's taken a crisis like this for the government, for governments to act on what you and I here in this forum already know of the injustices, the inequalities, the inequities that occur with drug use, and also with criminalization of drug use. As has been said quite often, COVID-19 is a great amplifier and magnifier in this case of the there's no other word for it, but what's the word I'm looking for? The foolishness, maybe that's not strong enough, of criminalizing drug use, because scientific evidence shows that it doesn't work to rehabilitate, and B, the cost, not just the financial cost, but the cost to the individual, their families, and society is extremely high. And we need to find a better way and a different way of dealing with drug use. So thank you.
Thank you. So we've got questions coming in. The first one that we have here is that, in Singapore, we commonly hear that, when we talk about these things, people often say, no, because we actually care about the victims and people who are struggling with addictions. It's the peddlers and the traffickers that we need to, deal with as criminals. So there's this sense that we need to differentiate between how we treat drug peddlers and people who are struggling with addiction. But so this is to anyone, all three of you, what do you think about this?
Yeah, so last year or in the previous government, when we actually got quite a bit of discussion going on decriminalization of drug use, I think by and large, a number of people are starting to accept that criminalization doesn't work, that drug use needs to be looked at through the lens of health and social impact and socioeconomic impact, but also going back to the root causes that we discussed today. So the decriminalization got quite far, but the concern by police, especially, is how do you differentiate between personal use and possession versus trafficking? So how do you quantify the amount that can be considered for personal use, and how do you, what quantity would you then regard someone as a trafficker? So we were about to launch, a study on this, but unfortunately there was a change in government, etc., because I think it's very, very important, and it's going to change based on in the case of heroin and other synthetic drugs, on the quality of the drugs. So just having the pills itself or the straws itself. So it's again, it's a very, very complex subject. Of course, and we have specific laws for possession. And so, yeah, these are the details that we need to work on if we continue to move forward with decriminalizing drug use. How do you separate? In fact, I think there's a lot of confusion around addiction and drug use. Everybody is lumped as being an addict, right? I mean, Winslow and those of us who work in the area know that not everyone who uses drugs become an addict. But the other false assumption, the other thing that we use a lot in our region is urine testing to diagnose someone as being an addict. And again, you know, addiction should be diagnosed by clinicians. So there are many things that need to be corrected from, you know, the correct definition of drug use and separating them from drug traffickers or those who have a small quantity of drugs to sell to what do you call it, to pay for their habits. I mean, that, you know, that's not making it right or wrong, but that's the reality, right? They're not big time traffickers. So unfortunately, those who tend to get picked up are these people and the small time traffickers, not the big fish that should really be the ones that police be focusing on, and not filling up the prisons with this, you know, people who use drugs and those who have may be a small amount to sustain their habit.
I think one of the issues that is also there would be that where Singapore has placed its primary agency that looks after drug addiction. So just like the what's the one in Malaysia?
ADK.
ADK. So ADK and CNB are fairly equivalent, but in Singapore, the CNB has also been put in charge of all aftercare or treatment. And so the funding, the monies and everything comes through Ministry of Home Affairs. And when things come from one ministry's perspective, which is primarily it is a legal and
security issue.
Security perspective, it does not look at the other things. And like Hong Kong, for example, Hong Kong, they have a drug board as well, narcotics board, but it is, I think, very heavily with the Ministry of the Family and Welfare, as well as health, because they have all these drug centers which do methadone, where they are staffed with both doctors as well as social workers and therapists. So again, it is where the money is coming from that to a large extent also decides what kind of treatment and how we treat people. Because in a police perspective or in a prison perspective, we are there to keep people safe or to make sure that we implement the law and keep them under the law. But in a bigger perspective, especially when they are released from prison, then it becomes, what do we do and how do we treat these people and reintegrate them back into society? And we can also learn from mental health, because in mental health, they have forensic teams for a person who goes into prison with a mental health issue. Before they come out, they've already had the community healthcare worker or psychiatric nurse or whatever else visiting them, visiting their family, putting into place programs to help them. And I think we are slowly trying to move this towards that perspective, where we have more community-driven initiatives, community-driven programs to help people get into, for example, support groups, we care, having case managers who will look after them. One of the moves that could actually be done quite easily would be to actually start implementing or allowing 12-step groups to meet in prison. And people who have made it on the outside, who have stayed well for longer periods of time by using Narcotics Anonymous or other 12-step programs, can actually share how the program works for them and help prepare people. And that would also, if the contacts are already made, then by the time they come out of prison, there's already a community or family that will be there to help them in their recovery journey. Yes, Kristen.
I think that's a very important point where this agency that's been charged to look after drug use is situated. Yeah, I mean,
Yes.
that's exactly the model we have, and they only know one thing, and that's punitive and criminal justice
Yeah.
way of dealing with it rather than supportive and evidence-based treatment.
Yes. And if I remember rightly, in most countries, Malaysia and Singapore included, the funding to MHA is usually a lot more than to health. I'm not sure what it is like in Malaysia, but I think that MHA in Singapore definitely gets more than health.
And to check in, if Ben would like to add on this point, the
Ben?
differentiation between, people saying that they want to differentiate between people who sell and peddle drugs and people who are struggling with addiction.
Okay, actually, Professor Adeeba has covered it on the part where I see most small-time peddlers who are the ones who got caught while they are cooking up in Myanmar 1 kilo. They're cooking out thousands of tons of drugs in Myanmar and bring it down. So those are the ones I believe who are supposed to be caught, not those small-time peddlers who sell to in order to fit their habit. So Professor Adeeba has covered what my views on why who should be caught, not. Thank you.
Thank you. So the next question is, someone was commenting that listening to Dr. Winslow and to Prof. Adeeba, it's clear that, we're not actually short on talent and experts in talking about policy and addiction treatment, and that there's also growing interest in people who want to be of service to those struggling with addiction. But do you think that the CNB is open to input and ideas? So perhaps Dr. Winslow would have more expertise on this. Do you think the CNB is open to the inputs and ideas of experts and groups that might run counter to the current practice of incarceration? And how do we bridge this kind of philosophical gap between the current government's approach to drugs and the harm reduction approach?
I do believe that Home Affairs and CNB actually do try to listen, because they would probably find it a lot easier to do their job if there were less people relapsing after incarceration. The very fact that they actually managed to change a lot of the drug laws, and Mr. Shamugam actually put into place some good changes as far as I am concerned at the beginning of this year, just before COVID hit, in terms of the Misuse of Drugs Act. But the other part that I find difficult, I think, is that they tend to rely on their own internal experts. And this is something that happens with all ministries, where they rely only on not all of government, but and not healthcare or not family. I think they should try the model that was used for gambling. Because I remember when we were looking at problem gambling in Singapore, they actually got together people from CID, because they knew that uh, there were gambling rings which were going to use to make use of this gambling junkets. They got people from Ministry of Community and Family. At that time, it is MCYS. They got people from the community agencies, churches, temples, and mosques to talk about it, and they got people from the healthcare services. And so able to bring together a whole bunch of people and say, let's sit and talk about how we can make this a better system, would be probably the best way to go, rather than at the moment, I'm not too sure how much input is coming from other ministries or agencies, because they have been doing this for a long time. And at least from my impression is that because they've had a fair amount of success in cutting down the overall numbers of drug users, it doesn't matter that the drug users convert over to legal drugs or to gambling or to other things, or to alcohol. Uh, they see it as, this is my job done. I have reduced the overall number of drug users. Whereas people who are looking at families and overall health of our citizens then would want to see, okay, it's not only having a drug user stopping their drug use, but making sure that they don't convert over to alcohol or to other substances or to legal sleeping pills or other things, which is why we need, again, a broader input that helps to look at what we are trying to get people out of their addiction and into the best possible life that they can have.
And the next question was, does anyone have thoughts on the UN reclassification of cannabis as a less dangerous drug?
It's definitely welcome, because at least in Malaysia, all the drugs are lumped into drugs of addiction. We don't have like the UK system of class A, B, C type drugs, which would, I think, go a long way in focusing on management and if and even fighting on trafficking issues and all of that. So that together with clearly defining addiction versus trafficking would be the first step, I think, towards our drug policy reform.
Prof. Adeeba, would you be able to tell us what it means when they reclassify cannabis? Because you're much more the statesperson, doctor.
So I think the other thing is there's a lot of confusion between medical marijuana and there's this almost schizophrenic thing going on in Malaysia, there being a push for legalizing medical marijuana, which then gets confused with the rest of us who want to decriminalize drugs, and I think it should be separated. First of all, personally, I think the evidence for the clinical use of medical marijuana is rather thin. So I'm not a big proponent of, medical marijuana for epilepsy and whatever else you want to use it for, or for cancer. Or I think there are other equally effective treatment, and the science behind medical marijuana is thin. So for that reason, I don't think that legalizing medical marijuana is the route we want to take. And also, I think more and more evidence coming out from the US, for instance, of if the use of marijuana is not regulated, then you run into its own problems. So there is this big confusion about, the decriminalization agenda, which is doesn't equal. I mean, decriminalization doesn't equal legalization. I think that's a very important concept for people to understand. Decriminalization means not putting people who have not created violence or caused any crime other than using drugs in prison. It doesn't mean that using drugs. I mean, it doesn't mean that we're legalizing marijuana and it can be used freely. So that distinction is very, very important to make.
No, Christine,
yeah.
As far as marijuana is concerned, I come from a psychiatric background, and I'm not too sure that marijuana is that safe a drug. But there are other reasons for why people want to decriminalize it, and that's not the medical route, because it does cause almost 5 to 10% of patients who use, especially with the high THC yield marijuanas, you actually get psychotic and do all kinds of strange things when you are on it. But because of the predominant voice right now is that, hey, let's let everybody enjoy it. And I think the jury is still out, because we will see what happens in all those states in Oregon and other places where they have they have not only decriminalized but legalized marijuana. And I remember coming from Vancouver a year or two ago, every street corner there were green pharmacies. It also means that there is a larger proportion of people who are addicted or dependent on marijuana. So I would be very careful about that part. But
Yeah, to me, I think just we should learn from alcohol and from cigarettes, you know, two addictive substances that cause equal harms to the equal health harms. First of all, health harms to the individuals, right? And the way out of it is to regulate it. I mean, you know, before during the prohibition time, I believe alcohol created as much chaos and damage as what we're seeing with drug use currently. So, but by regulating it, having clear, you know, age limits and sale, it's not going to absolutely um, stop people from getting addicted and getting, you know, harmful use, but at least you are going to hopefully eliminate the underworld distribution of these things that are equally harmful. And so I think we, you know, mature societies, we should move towards regulating this way, because, you know, I got hammered when I said that in a way cigarettes are more harmful than some of these drugs. You know, you in Malaysia, we sent someone to the gallows to what is it? I can't remember now. You know, of ganja to 2 kilograms, or which is not a lot, right? And yet, you know, when you think of it, so would you? I mean, I know you've said that cannabis can cause harmful effects. I fully acknowledge that, but so do cigarettes. But we don't send the girl who sells, you know, 2 cartons of cigarettes in the duty-free shop at the airport to the gallows for those cigarettes that can cause lung cancer, right? So yeah, I got severely criticized for saying that before, and may get criticized again. But if you use that kind of logic, then you see, you know, likewise, we don't send someone to the gallows for selling fancy wines and whiskey and gin in a wine shop that can cause brain damage, heart damage, liver damage, family damages, the same kind of individual health problems as well as societal problems. You know, alcohol addiction is just as bad as drug addiction. It's just we don't see the added impact because people don't get put in prison for using alcohol.
yes, I agree.
Okay, our next question then is, are there studies that shed light on how community support affects the recidivism rates in different countries?
Sorry, Kristen, I'm going to end Winslow,
Yes.
and Ben, I'm really, really sorry, but I'm going to have to jump off now to another teleconference.
It's all right.
So
thank you so
very much for having me. I'm happy to do this
Yes.
Again some other time.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, bye.
So
Thanks a lot, Prof.
yeah, I suppose we'll continue. So Dr. Winslow, you showed during your presentation the recidivism rate in Singapore. So I suppose this question also relates to, you know, are there studies that shed light on the recidivism rates of different countries? How does Singapore's rate compare to others? And, you know, how much does community support affect that?
I think recidivism rate is, you have to be very careful of what we are talking about, because we are not really measuring that the person is well contributing member of society or able to look after family and other things. Or all we are measuring is that they are not using illicit drugs. So they could have converted over, and I see them quite often. people who have converted over to using a whole bunch of legal drugs from Geylang or wherever else in Singapore, and yet there would be considered a success rate in terms of CNB's paradigm. It's the same rationale for, and this, I'm not being racist or anything here, but there are a lot of people who have been hooked, a lot of Malays and Indian Muslims who are hooked on alcohol, who are hooked on heroin, but because they are scared to death of going back to prison, then convert over to becoming alcoholics. And we still consider those as success rates. So my basic philosophy is that, look, if you want, yes, you have to stop the primary addiction, but you also have to stop all the other dysfunctional behaviors that come along with it. So there needs to be a program, and what Ben is going through, maybe Ben can even share with us a little bit about why he goes to NA groups. I heard him say that he joined NA, right? But why go to NA groups, and why go for ongoing care? This is one big issue that we have. When I see people in prison, I often really worry because the predominant thing is, so what is your plan for when you leave prison? Oh, I'm going to get a job. I said, but you've already come into prison 3 or 4 times for drug addiction. How is a job going to help you? He says, well, I don't have to worry about it because in prison I don't have any cravings. And me trying to explain to them that in a structured environment where you don't have to think about what time to wake up, what time to eat, what time to do anything, there's no stresses as in normal life, doesn't work. And people have to come to the idea, and this is again where people have to have an understanding that overcoming an addiction is all of brain activity. You need to put in family support, but more than family support, you also need the support of people, a recovery group, or people who are working a program, any program. In Singapore, the best available one right now is the 12-Step Narcotics Anonymous. And of course, having counseling or therapy for their other issues. We Care Community Services, I think, has got either 7 or 10 counselors who will help people who ask for the help. And they will help families as well to prepare for when their loved one comes out of incarceration. Sorry, did I answer anything or have I gone off track?
Well, I think one of the questions was that is our recidivism rate, for example, considered very high compared to other places, or what?
Okay, so the answer was the answer is no, you're not considered high compared to the past. But part of that reason is because they convert over to use other stuff.
And the next question was that, for example, in the US, the war on drugs was used and has been criticized as a strategy to incarcerate Black people, to use them as prison labor. And what about Singapore? When certain addictions seem to be racialized. We've seen drugs talked about as something that affects the Malay community. What are the thoughts on as Singapore's drug laws and their greater purpose in sort of maintaining this rule, authoritarian rule in Singapore?
I don't really quite buy into that because I think that all the addictions have got different groups which are predominant. As you know, whenever I give talks and I ask a community which is the biggest group that drinks, for example, you know what the answer is going to be. Most people will say Indians or things. It's not entirely true, but it is because Indians drink like Anglo-Saxons, and the Chinese drink just as much, but they drink more like Mediterranean drinkers. So you don't see the dysfunction that comes along with it. You've seen in Malaysia. Malaysia has got as much the predominant race using drugs of abuse in Malaysia is still the Malays, and yet they are not a minority there. They are actually a majority. I think more than that, what you need to look at then is the marginalization and dysfunction that happens, because those are the drivers of how a person gets into and maintains their drug addiction. Okay.
But what about, so I mean, like, for example, like gambling is seen as a problem that affects the Chinese community, but the approach to it is very different from, say, drugs. We have like a national problem gambling council. It's seen as a national problem, whereas a lot of the coverage I've seen about drugs are like, oh, the Malay community should sort it out. Drugs are haram, and it's so clearly targeted to one specific community.
I think that there are multiple drivers of this. Uh, it's historical in the Singapore context, and I think Lee Kuan Yew had a point when he put in a lot of the drug laws, because he was trying to break not only the drug addiction, which he saw as a danger to our society, but also the gangs that ran the drug addiction. And the gangs that ran the drug addiction, or the heroin and all the rest, were actually Chinese gangs more than Malay or Indian gangs. But yes, as society develops or as time changes, we need to look at the approaches that we have to a problem. And we need to do, for example, the same kind of all of government or all of society approaches by getting together. In Hong Kong, they have people from uh, Department of Welfare, Department of Health, and all the rest, and including the police. Here, it is slightly different because the predominant people who are actually managing the drug addiction problem come from only one ministry, and that is the difficulty that we have currently. But I think that they are open, and I think that it requires more talks and more awareness in society, that society has to get more and more open, that these are not evil people who, as you've seen from Ben's case and so many of others, I really enjoy meeting with my ex-patients, or after therapy, or after they've been well. Uh, these are people who have had issues, and now are learning how to get out of it. And it's not just the difficulty is that we have demonized the drug and made the drug synonymous. Drugs are evil, and so therefore people who use them are evil. And what Prof. Adeeba was talking about just earlier before she left was that um, we have to kind of separate out the drug use from the we. I come from a Christian background, so it's kind of, we hate the sin, but we love the sinner. And we want to see people get well. We want to see people meet their best perspectives in life. Oh no, I don't know how to turn this off, but okay.
So we have a question for Ben. So Ben, how does We Care and NA support you and others? And what other forms of support do you think are needed for people who are recovering from addiction?
Okay, as for We Care, again, I start from NA. NA is a group of fellow addicts who, the people with clean time, they try to show us the way, like the newcomers, on how to lead life without using drugs, and they show us that to keep things simple, and how to manage our thoughts and all. So at We Care is a center, drop-in center, where there are counselors and all. So far I've benefited a lot. I coming from a poor family, I when I was in school, I didn't learn how to manage my feelings, my thoughts. I didn't know all these things. So now when I'm in We Care, I learn about having tools, mindfulness. They teach us yoga, and when feelings or emotions that are tough to handle, what can we do? We can do breathing, and we can the tools are, they teach us the tools to manage my stresses. Usually my stresses, they I learned a lot. I learned a lot of tools to manage all these emotions, which I didn't know how to last time.
But what other forms of support do you think we need to help people then?
As previously Dr. Winslow mentioned, total different from different sides, from hospital side, from counselor side, from prison side, CMB side, all together try to help with family support and all. That's the best.
Mm. And so the next question then is, to what extent do you think that so for both of you, what extent do you think that people who struggle with addiction internalize the narrative that they are trouble for society, and how do these framings and narratives kind of affect recovery?
Okay, let me give it a go. I think you're very right in the sense that a lot of the people who have gone through incarceration and addiction come out with the feeling that they are actually bad people. And they don't come out with the feeling that, okay, I am a good person who's a bit screwed up at the moment because I've managed to get myself addicted to something, or I cannot function without going down a certain route. And so, yes, having I think we are slowly, Singapore, we are very, very gradual in our progress. It would move faster if a lot more people pushed for it, but we are very gradual in the sense that, and deliberate, that we are slowly moving towards, like I said, they put in this three strikes law in the 1990s. 1993, I think, was when people from Texas and California came to advise MHA on three strikes laws. But currently, just this year, Mr. Shanmugam has actually removed a lot of the three strikes laws and allowed people with addictions not to go in for the incredibly long incarceration periods that they used to have. So that's the other part, is internal locus of control and external locus. And this is where we teach people. The best example that I always have is that um, when I first came back from Australia, I used to have my kids, when we go to the beach, they used to start cleaning the beach and picking up all the rubbish and everything. And once they had put a big box and they put all the rubbish in it and were trying to collect it so they could dispose of it. And somebody came up and took the whole box of rubbish, walked down to the sea and threw it into the sea. And you see my kids chasing after them and asking them, "What are you doing?" And he basically said, "Don't worry about it. The tide is going out. The rubbish will go to Indonesia." Um, the principle was that, you know, the internal locus of control is that people have to understand why they're doing something. They want to be better people. They want to do the right thing. One of the difficulties that we have in our drug laws is that it is kind of authoritarian or external locus of control for everything. That our patients or clients who go into prison switch off their brains. They don't think because they are told what to do at every phase of things. And when they come out as addicts, they don't think of themselves that, okay, I got to know what is it that I want to do to get well. I need to go for groups because that's where people are going to help me the most. I need to get my family or my life in order. I need to do things for myself. So that's an internal locus. But because there are a lot of the time, we are all waiting for authority figures to tell us what to do, tell us to do this or to do that, that we don't take the responsibility as much on our own for their recovery.
There's another question for Ben. So how did incarceration and caning affect your life and your recovery?
Okay, there's no Dr. Winslow to cover it. When I came out, I had the stigma. I didn't feel like I didn't feel like I went for recovery because I came out, I had to shy away from my friends because people knew I went to prison, and I even got fired after 1 month after getting a job because the employer managed to find out that I had a drug record, which I didn't declare. So These are the sticks that affected me a lot mentally, but I decided to like take things into my own hands. Ownership, accountability, and responsibility are these three things. Like just mentioned, Dr. Winslow just mentioned, I took the own initiative to change myself, to not have all these thoughts and just make it happen. I try to make it happen with the support of any and everything.
And the next question, when you layer drug use with research showing that addiction has links with sexuality, disenfranchisement, poverty, race, all topics that are kind of no-go zones in Singapore, how does that impact public discourse and policy making?
I think the answer is that if we want to get more input into how to get people well, we must be safe in when we are talking about it. And if we don't have the safety and people do not feel free to discuss issues, I mean, we see that exactly in our issue or our almost epidemic of upskirt videos or voyeurism in our Singapore males in NUS and everywhere else. Uh, People for years do not talk about stuff, but they allow things to happen or to go on. When something's happened, then there's a scramble to recover or to talk about stuff. So for me, it is let's have a civic space or a community space where people can discuss issues which may have more than one viewpoints and find out what it is uh, that people want in recovery. And I think it's not just the LGBTQI or the drug addiction. How about cigarette smokers? I've seen so many cigarette smokers who would like to have more alternatives or ability to reduce and cut down their actual cigarette smoking, but the agenda is already set. You see, so it's already set that this is the way that it is, and we know what is best for you. But when people want to show that there are alternative ways to get well, that becomes a little bit more difficult and it will take time. The way that I see in Singapore, things take time, but eventually they get there. I hope. Now, Kristen, I've got to run because all those calls were actually NUS calling me because one of my patients got admitted.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry to hear that. But I think we're already coming to the end of the session. But yeah, so there's just one question left, which is what is the approach here for minors or young people who use drugs? Given that there's evidence showing, genetic and environmental risk, as you mentioned, what's being done to support youth to rehabilitate so that they have opportunities in adulthood?
I think this is one area which the government has actually done a really good job, or at least is doing a better job, because the most difficult people in the world to treat are teenagers and young adults when it comes to drug use or alcohol or any addiction. They always feel that one, they will get away with it, or two, it's not going to harm their brains or anything else. But what I've seen is that now there's a couple of tracks, and unfortunately, I don't think CNB is doing a good enough job of telling people what they are doing in terms of young people therapy. They've got a YES program, which is run by MSF, which will put people in just counseling or therapy for a year if you're still schooling or you're in your young adulthood. There's the CRC, or Community Rehabilitation Center. I think it is a 6-month program, 3 months in and then 3 months out, and then after that, another 6 months. So they're doing a lot more things than they're actually talking about. But that's part of the difficulty. If you talk about this is what is we are trying out, and let us show everybody what the evidence is for whether it works or not, we will feel a lot more encouraged that we are heading in the right direction.
Yep. So thank you, Dr. Winslow, for your time today. It's okay if you have to run now, but we have just one question which we're going to end this session with for Ben, actually. So Ben, the question was if you can comment on how poverty and other stress factors are connected to drug use, both in your own experience and that of people you know, And there's like a part 2 to this, and like, how do you think people who use drugs to support their habit should be, or sell drugs to support their habit should be supported beyond medical treatment? What other sort of changes are needed to reduce the stress in people's lives?
Okay, I think the government has to make a work-life balance for everyone in Singapore. So those who don't have enough money, I wonder how. For me, I still don't know how to make more money. The only way I know is to work more longer hours. That's the only way for me. I feel I don't have a high education. I don't know how to do business. So I only know the only way for me is I need to work more and more and more to have more money. That's the only way. And I feel because of that, and my parents also came from the same structure. They didn't know, they don't know how to earn money also. So they were normal people, and that's the cycle just carry on that way. So that's how I feel the government should change, take care of the lower, what you call it, low income family more.
So do you think there are like specific, so for your own experience, like, do you think there were specific things apart from like the medical and counseling treatment that you felt that you really could have used as a support?
Yeah, maybe. But from what I know, there's no for my drug of choice. There's no medicine yet. There's only like counseling and psychiatry for my drug of choice. But for other drugs, I feel that I think there is medicine which could have been given to me also for my drug of choice. Then as you see just now, for the drug trafficking side, most of the people I know who traffic, from my opinion, my experience is people who are in poverty, they need money. So that's the easiest way. My dad was a drug trafficker too. So he sold drugs because he was a single dad taking care of two children. So he chose to sell drugs because I asked him why did he sell, why did he choose that. He says it's the fastest way to have money, earn money.
I think, well, thank you so much, Ben, for sharing, and for all the other speakers, although they've had to run off. Thank you so much to everyone for tuning in as well. So I think we've come to the end of this session, but if you want to catch up on any bits, the video will still be on our Facebook page. I think I've seen some people like live tweet a little bit, so you can catch up on Twitter as well. But thank you so much, everyone. We hope like this is like just the beginning of the conversation to help people learn together and to start thinking about this issue. And so we hope that all the conversations will just keep going. And if you have anything, you can always like comment on the page or write into us. And we'll also be putting up a write-up of key learnings from the session on our website, so you can look out for that as well. But thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in today.